It is with great honour and pleasure that I present our next plenary speaker, Paul Thompson. We've been trying to get him to come to an IDEA conference for several years. Now, it's not that he hasn't been to any. He was in Honduras in 1992 and a couple of other events, but hasn't been since then. So it's really great for me and for many other IDEA members to actually have Paul among us today. Also, on behalf of IDEA, I would like to reiterate the thanks that Eric expressed on Monday for the generous financial support Paul has given to the conference. We've heard during this conference, beginning from Asun's presidential address to the panel presentation we heard yesterday by Jay, Nigel and Des, the importance of linking environmental issues to development ethics. I think Paul's work is exemplar in this area. I think he does a great job in linking environmental ethics to development ethics. Paul is a renowned philosopher in the area of environmental philosophy and environmental ethics, particularly on the issues of agriculture, sustainability, and food ethics. Paul holds the W.K. Kellogg Chair in Agriculture, Food, and Community Ethics at Michigan State University. His research has centered on ethical and philosophical questions associated with agriculture and food, and especially concerning the guidance and development of agriculture technoscience. He is the author of 13 books and editions, such as The Spirit of the Soil, Agriculture and Environmental Ethics, The Ethics of Aid and Trade, Food Biotechnology in Ethical Perspective, and co-editor of The Agrarian Roots of Pragmatism. He has served on many national and international committees on agricultural biotechnology and contributed to the National Research Council report, The Environmental Effects of Transgenic Plants. He is a past president of the Agriculture, Food and Human Values Society and the Society for Philosophy and Technology, and is secretary of International Society for Environmental Ethics. Paul's new work focuses on nanotechnology in the agri-food system. The session will consider the following format. Paul will talk for 40 minutes, then we will have hopefully about 20 minutes for questions. So I'll now pass the microphone to Paul Thompson.
Thank you, Anna. It's a pleasure to be back at an IDEA meeting after an embarrassingly long absence. As Anna has suggested, I often find myself doing, I think, work that's very much in the spirit of IDEA. I've been involved in quite a number of activities related to agriculture and agricultural research around the world, related especially to development issues. As a matter of fact, in 1 week I'll be in Curitiba, Brazil, the only philosopher in the room, at a conference on animal welfare, really trying to start to think about animal welfare in much more of a context of Latin American agriculture and agricultural production. So I'm excited about that interaction, but it has kept me away from IDEA for over 20 years. I probably should have prepared a paper that was, kind of the adventures of a roving philosopher. It might have been interesting, and maybe I'll do that sometime in the future. But what I have prepared is a little bit more traditionally philosophical today, and it fits. I'm trying to kind of accomplish 2 or 3 things. One of them, I am trying to work within the spirit of this meeting, looking back on IDEA's history, and I'll actually go back a decade prior to the beginnings of IDEA in 1984 and think about what was going on in philosophy as it related to development in the 1970s, which was when I was doing my graduate work and starting to think about some of the issues that have occupied me for my whole career. But I've also been quite disturbed. One of the things that's really motivated a lot of my thinking is that there really continues to be something of an assumption, maybe not so much in this room, but among many development professionals, including many professionals in agriculture, that ultimately what agricultural development means is getting people out of agriculture, that the only future for agriculture is one where we have a very small percentage of people in farming. In the United States, it's currently less than 2%. In Europe, it's less than 4%. And the vision seems to have been that's the way development in agriculture has to go. Whereas in many parts of Africa, it's still 80% of the population in agriculture, and generally throughout the world, it's roughly now, I think globally, we have about 50% of the world's population living in cities, and of the remaining 50%, we can be assured that a fairly large percent have something to do with agriculture. And I've been trying to think about, sort of troubled by that assumption, and have been trying to develop, some broader context of what agriculture does for us, and why we might actually want to think about and vision in agriculture that probably doesn't have 80% of the population in agriculture. I'm not sure that many people want to be farmers, but certainly that has a much more robust participation than we see in the United States. So I'm going to try to pull some of these things together, and I've actually found that Amartya Sen's work provides a nice way to frame that, and I'm sure that there's a lot of familiarity with that in the room. So with that, let me begin. It actually may be difficult for scholars who are under 55 to appreciate how pervasively themes of famine dominated philosophical work in development ethics before 1990, before the Brundtland Report and the Rio Declaration and a lot of thinking. Although scholars in development ethics might prefer to begin with Denis Goulet's The Cruel Choice, in many respects, Peter Singer's 1972 paper, Famine, Affluence, and Morality, probably had more influence, certainly during the 1970s and 1980s. Singer discussed the Bengal famine and claimed that comparatively well-off individuals had a moral obligation to offer assistance. The philosophical basis for this obligation rested on a principle that Singer said would be supported by any moral theory. If someone can prevent serious harm at little cost for themselves, they are obligated to do so. He argued for this principle using his famous drowning child argument. A few years later, Singer would deploy the same principle in his argument for animal liberation and vegetarian diets. Philosophical work on hunger and famine continued with a special issue of the journal Soundings, which was quickly republished under the title Lifeboat Ethics in 1976, and it was followed in the next year by at least two other anthologies that had very large print runs, Peter Brown and Henry Shue's Food Policy, and Will Aiken and Hugh LaFollette's World Hunger and Moral Obligation. Singer continues to support versions of his original argument for supporting aid, even as he himself exhibits the trend away from couching the argument in terms of food and famine in his recent book, The Life You Can Save. Although Singer's moral argument was and continues to be an enduring influence on philosophers, it was not in itself responsible for the tendency to emphasize food issues in the 1970s. PL 480, the Food for Peace program, was authorized by the Congress of the United States in 1954. For many decades, and perhaps even still, this program of finance for programming at the U.S. Agency for International Development has shaped the public debate over foreign aid, especially in the United States. The original rationale was to use surplus production by U.S. farmers for Marshall Fund-style development assistance. The image of using unneeded American food to prevent hunger in the developing world had significant political appeal within the United States and was initially supported by farmers anxious to find markets for excess production that would only depress prices if it was held in storage or sold on domestic markets in the United States. PL 480 funds were thus a very significant source of both political and monetary support for foreign assistance in the United States, and this rhetorical framing for aid, tying it to hunger, had a disproportionate impact on the way that everyone, including academic philosophers, conceptualized foreign aid during the 1970s. PL 480 had a number of critics, however, and some of them were coming from the field of population ecology. Garrett Hardin wrote a series of articles against food aid on the ground that it would only encourage unsustainable population growth in the developing world. For several decades, philosophy professors teaching college courses in applied ethics used anthologies with Singer arguing for food assistance paired against Hardin making the ecological case for allowing the death rate to take its toll. And indeed, the Thomas Pogge Keith Horton collection of seminal essays in global ethics includes this same pairing, published in 2008. The challenges of global population growth were brought to popular attention by the book The Population Bomb, which sold over 2 million copies since its original publication in 1968. Working with his wife Anne, Paul Ehrlich predicted that the decade of the 1970s would be characterized by a food shortage and punctuated by a series of devastating famines in India, Africa, and Latin America. The message that many took from this book was one of imminent and uncontrolled growth of global population accompanied by extensive and massive starvation. A quote from the book, "There are only two kinds of solution to the population problem. One is a birth rate solution in which we find ways to lower the birth rate. The other is a death rate solution in which ways to raise the death rate, war, famine, pestilence find us," end quote. The Ehrlichs have not backed down from this summary statement of the book's general approach to population ecology, repeating it in an article in 2007. Garrett Hardin tied their ecological analysis to a critique of altruism, arguing that it is unethical to provide aid to poor nations in the absence of a birth rate solution, because doing so would only defer the onset of famine, leading to an even greater amount of suffering in the future. Now, famine and food shortages certainly occur, and the Ehrlichs may even be right in predicting more of them in humanity's future. Many of the authors who contributed to this literature in the 1970s had an informed understanding of food security and its attendant complexities, although many others, and here I would conclude Singer, used the widespread perception of imminent food shortages to motivate more general points in moral theory and to examine the goals of development. A further sketch of how famine and hunger shaped the discussion of development ethics in the 70s and 80s is beyond the scope of my talk today, though there's actually a very nice article by Hugh LaFollette from 2003. So it must suffice to say that the few food shortages that were predicted for the 1970s didn't happen. That's a point that the Ehrlichs now concede, giving credit to Green Revolution technologies. Many of the deeper and more enduring debates over Malthusianism, population growth, and resource scarcity have now been absorbed into a more theoretically complex debate over sustainable development, though that literature only makes indirect or elliptical reference to food. So now turning to, I think, some of the way that Sen changed this thinking. In short, early development work in development ethics presupposed that an undersupply of food would cause catastrophic famine in the developing world, and it was dedicated to advancing the moral rationale for affluent nations and individuals to do something about it. The predicted famines failed to materialize, and these rationales have now been shifted to a more general and abstract imperative for development, or they've been reattached to other problems in development, such as refugees, ethnic conflict, violence against women, and to new predictions of calamity from climate change. So in a sense, the moral dimensions of the debate haven't changed, but people really don't focus too much on hunger and famine anymore. To the extent that hunger remains on the agenda of development ethics, it is seen as a symptom of more systemic problems. A more sophisticated analysis of food insecurities began to emerge with Amartya Sen's empirical study of two famines, one being Bengal famines, such as the one alluded to by Singer, and the second being famine in Ethiopia between 1971 and 1975. The theoretical point that Sen drew from this work emphasizes failure in a given individual's food entitlement. Sen's work shows that the failure he had in mind concerns Sen's subsequent work shows that the failure he had in mind concerns a singularly important capability. The terminology of entitlements is actually potentially misleading, for Sen's concept of food entitlements does not imply a legally or legislatively mandated guarantee. It's not even really a right. It is instead intended as a concept that unifies three institutionally distinct ways in which people have secure access to food. The first type of institutional structure is an income-based entitlement, the source of food security for the vast majority of people living in the developed world. People with an income-based food entitlement buy their food. People in the developed world who lose a job typically have a backup, however, which is what Sen referred to as a gift or grant-based entitlement. Industrial states have a variety of programs for providing impoverished people with vouchers to ensure a minimal food ration. The current U.S. program is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, while a locally administered program of vouchers was introduced in the United Kingdom in 2013. Alternatively, industrial societies may elect to provide general income support for the impoverished or unemployed as a way to ensure universal food security. In general, gift or grant entitlements can be secured by private charitable food assistance programs as well, and these might be operated by churches or other non-governmental organizations. It's the third type of entitlement that is my focus today, the direct production-based entitlement. Some people rely on farming, fishing, or some form of hunting and scavenging to obtain the food they eat. Each type of entitlement has its own institutional structure and accompanying vulnerabilities. It is clear that the most straightforward vulnerability for income-based entitlements occurs when people lose their job. But Sen's work showed that this is not the whole story. And furthermore, institutions that back up an income-based entitlement with vouchers or cash may not actually do much good in some of the kinds of situations he was examining in poverty and famines. There he argued that the income and gift-based entitlements of poor people in East Bengal collapsed because of a rapid inflation that was at root unrelated to the food economy. Although food was available in Bengali shops, it was out of reach for people whose income, savings, and grants of cash had lost a great deal of their value. In contrast, the Ethiopian famines were failures in direct production entitlements owing to regional drought and pestilence. The crops of Ethiopian farmers failed, and lacking any backup at all, starvation was the result. Now, Sen famously argued that in both cases, adequate food supplies could have been located nearby. This aspect of his argument was intended as a broadly based critique of the assumption implied by food aid programs such as PL 480, as well as charitably based programs that Singer was recommending in 1972. The famines that were being experienced in the 1960s and 1970s were not Malthusian failures, nor did they require transfer of food across continents to address. The lesson that many people took from this is that hunger is, quote, not a problem of production, it's a problem of distribution, end quote. More broadly, Sen's work has led many subsequent scholars in development ethics to focus solely on income and poverty. I will argue that while not entirely false, this reaction to Sen's early work needs substantial supplementation. We need a better understanding of how direct food production entitlements contribute to capability and functioning. So I got a little section in here on emergencies. Most of what I'm going to say doesn't apply to emergency situations, typhoons, floods, places where there's a short-term problem. But what I really want to focus on is the more typical case of a standard kind of development problem associated with farmers and direct production entitlements. The security of a direct production entitlement is partly a function of how it is structured. Poor farmers may have a crop such as rice, maize, millet, cassava, or beans in the ground, but they are very likely to be augmenting their food needs with other things that they're growing in pots or tiny plots, as well as the odd hen or goat, or they may be scavenging some wild plants and hunting in the forests. They are almost certainly trading and bartering whatever they are able to acquire both in their main plots and in their subsequent plots or through scavenging, perhaps among neighbors, but also in local street markets, or through buyers who consolidate the production of many smallholders, in which case some of this goes into global markets. There may not be much difference between a small fruit producer whose main crop is literally something they can eat, like beans or grain, and a smallholder producing coffee, tea, or cotton, whose supplemental garden may be vital to their food entitlement, but who will certainly be trading in order to achieve any degree of food security. A direct food entitlement will thus be affected by what farmers are able to sell, whether that is a portion of some crop that they are growing, either food or non-food, or something like tubers, insects, mushrooms, eggs, or meat that they acquire through an ancillary activity. In today's world, virtually all smallholders are integrated into the money economy to some degree or another. The linkage between any given food producer and global markets is, of course, variable. But fluctuation in the global price for a particular food commodity, such as wheat or soybeans, has a meaningful impact on the welfare of anyone with a direct production entitlement. Their food security is stronger when they get more in cash or barter for whatever it is they are trading. But even a weak linkage to global prices is precisely why their food security may be at odds with the capabilities of the urban poor who depend entirely on an income or gift-based food entitlement. There are therefore 2 points that development ethicists should take from Sen's work on the way that food-related capabilities are structured. The first is to notice that the fundamental tension between direct production entitlements and income-based entitlements. For those with an income-based entitlement, it is always a good thing when food prices go down. For those who produce food, an increase in the market price may actually strengthen their overall capability set. This is at bottom nothing more than the classic conflict of interest between buyers and sellers, though the ethical significance of this conflict depends upon a moderately sophisticated understanding of the way that food entitlements intersect with income for people who make their living in farming, fishing, or some other form of food or agricultural production. The second point to notice is that a development ethics constructed on the assumption that income or gift-based entitlements are the global paradigm for food security is very likely to cause havoc for poor people who produce food. Recent work by Olivier de Schutter, the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Food, emphasizes that between 60 and 80% of the world's poorest people still live in rural areas and have livelihoods tied to the productive use of natural resources. Actually, approximately half of these people are farmers. About 20% are either landless labor or people who drive trucks or do things that are otherwise tied to the local food economy. And then about 10% are people who are either scavenging mushrooms or fishing or engaging in some other kind of food production activity. 50%, however, are farmers. That is, that they're not earning wages. They're actually their income, their livelihood is directly tied to the actual production of the crop. So given these figures, a food ethics that's built narrowly on strengthening income and income-based entitlements may actually miss the majority of the world's poorest people. And here this is the standard extreme poverty figure, essentially approximately less than €1 per day in income. In fact, the situation is worse than that, for as many have argued before me, bringing in food aid to help people who are suffering actually exacerbates the problem that's being faced by those with a production entitlement. The extra food that's coming in the form of aid from outside suddenly appears on local markets, and that causes a price collapse. The price of food locally goes down, and that creates a threat to the food security of producers that might not have existed in the absence of a food aid program. The upshot is that while Sen's characterization of the 3 general types of food entitlement provides a starting snapshot for a more nuanced picture of nutritional capabilities, it should not be taken to imply that people with a direct production entitlement are never themselves producers of food. It would not be unusual, for example, for smallholders to find themselves in the market for stored roots or grains during and shortly after the planting season, when their own food supplies are running low and before new crops are ready to eat. Nonetheless, the money that they have to purchase food during that lean time of the year will very likely reflect the price that they got for whatever they were able to sell after the harvest. The upshot for a theory of human development is that further questions await anyone who really attempts to operationalize a theory of food entitlements for the purpose of policymaking. One can't just focus on poverty and incomes. I might add one additional nuance to this picture. Differences in what smallholders are producing, whether it be rice, maize, or saleable goods, such as wild fruits or fish, matter a great deal. But here in the interest of simplicity, I'll just refer to all of these goods as a crop, right? So crop losses, people can experience a rapid decline in the value of these crops in a way that's actually quite similar to the way that urban poor are vulnerable to hyperinflation. This is what's happening when food aid comes in, but any kind of sudden glut can actually create a kind of economically based vulnerability. But there's also just straightforward physical vulnerability that can damage the security of a food entitlement if you're basing your livelihood on a direct production entitlement. Crop losses can occur from the result of drought or flood or from a disease. They can be lost through predation by wild animals or insects. They can be stolen. They can be destroyed by other human beings. Crops of all kinds exhibit this kind of vulnerability to one degree or another. And this makes the physical security of the crop, and particularly the field in which a crop is, the place where the crop is sitting, an important interest for smallholders. In short, the direct production entitlement creates an interest among smallholders that's at least something like a property right, even among the very poor. James C. Scott has argued that this need for security of your fields has actually created the basis for peasant farmers' willingness to tolerate and even support local landowning elites. They were getting something from the elites. The elites were ensuring that people weren't coming in and stealing their crops. So long as the farmers, the tenants, also perceived a sense of fair dealing and were able to achieve their subsistence capabilities. Now I want to turn away from the food security aspect of direct production entitlements and start to think about some broader ways in which direct production relates to capabilities, and I want to link this to some of the recent ideas that are emerging in connection with food sovereignty. So Sim's work in the theory of development recognizes the distinction between capability and functioning. Capabilities are practically realizable actions or doings that people might take to improve their lives. A capability that is realized creates a functioning or a domain of individual or social life in which needs and desires that meaningfully improve the quality of life are being actualized. Sim illustrates the distinction by pointing out that there's a difference between a wealthy person fasting and a poor person with the same level of functioning who is unable to choose anything else. People want to choose which among their many needs and desires they will realize, even despite their limited means. Educational opportunity or even health care may be forgone willingly in some cases. As David Crocker has emphasized, eating a steady, healthful, and satisfying diet is a functioning. It is a singularly important functioning, both for its intrinsic value and for the way that it is generally presupposed by many other types of functioning. So food security is a capability that enables this functioning. However, food security is not all that there is to a direct production entitlement. The key vulnerabilities that I've just discussed illustrate how direct production entitlements expand to capabilities beyond food security. The economic risks of price fluctuation discussed begin to illustrate this point, and I've noted other risks that are tied to land tenure, being able to hold on to your land, and the security of the land. Once again, the range of variation is extreme when you look across all farmers. The South Asian farmers that were studied by Scott were long-standing tenants of local landowners. On a global basis, some tenants pay cash rent, while others pay a share of the crop. Still others work some portion in the landowner's field and tend their own plots on the side. Some are fortunate enough to have property rights in the land they farm. There are some areas of the globe where alienable land titles have never been established, and so tenure is based on tradition and occupancy. The ejido system in Mexico provides a village-owned parcel in which smallholders have access to subsistence supplies. There's just a lot of variability here. Access to fisheries may be entirely unmanaged, though it's more typical for some form of common pool governance system to oversee access and rights of use. In each case, it's plausible to regard subsistence capabilities as relying on a direct production entitlement, and to see this entitlement as itself reliant upon the long-term stability and renewal of the producer's access to land or to an equivalent natural resource such as a forest or a lake. This secondary vulnerability explains why land reform and land excess are crucial issues both for food security and for some additional capabilities among small landholders. The fact that additional capabilities are implicated by food production shows that there's more to direct production entitlements than the functioning of adequate diets. Along with Send, Crocker has emphasized agency among the capabilities that are the goal and focus of development. Here the word agency stands for a fairly complex set of conditions, operational means, and skills that allow people to have a voice and some measure of control over the circumstances in which they live and work. Crocker is most intently focused on political agency, the ability to express one's view and have some impact on the processes of government and social decision-making. Equally important to smallholders is what I'm going to call economic agency. I don't know if this is a good term, but I'll use it today. The ability to undertake, direct, and influence the activities that secure the means for daily living and subsistence. For many people in industrial society, economic agency depends on a robust job market with numerous and diverse opportunities for employment. Industrial societies also secure a capability for entrepreneurship, a more independent form of economic agency where people take personal and financial risks with no particular guarantee of a corresponding reward. Relatively few may choose to convert their capability for entrepreneurship. Actually, I'm assuming that few in this room are entrepreneurs. I certainly depend on a job. Relatively few may convert this into a functioning and advanced industrial society, but the capability itself is nonetheless thought to be an important component of autonomy and personal freedom. Although smallholders around the globe are generally quite poor, sometimes desperately poor, in many cases they possess a significant amount of what I'm calling economic agency. Unless they are obligated to work for wages on a landowner's plot, no one tells them when it is time to go to work, and no one tells them what to do. They may be compelled to work by necessity, and their farming choices may be constrained by location, technology, and their knowledge base. But within these constraints, the crops they plant, the way they tend or harvest them, and the husbandry they practice is largely up to them. Their activity is not specified by a boss or a supervisor. Even when small farmers are so poor that they lack a secure food entitlement, they nonetheless have a capability that will be weakened and even lost entirely when they exit farming to become wage workers. Unskilled workers in a minimum wage economy are entirely dependent on someone else to create an employment opportunity. Lacking a job, they are dependent on the gifts and grants of government or charities to achieve their most basic functionings. In either case, they have lost agency to structure and control their daily work in pursuit of subsistency, and this is an agency that is actually a current capability for many poor farmers. I would argue that these agency-related capabilities can be seen as a basis for some of the recent interest in food sovereignty. The idea of food sovereignty originated in connection with the work of Via Campesina, a coalition of civil society groups that are working with or in support of smallholder groups on a worldwide basis. Excuse me. The phrase food sovereignty was coined specifically to counter development policies that were being pursued under the banner of food security. Food security was being interpreted as access to nutritionally adequate diets. The package of policies being pursued in support of it presumed that food security would be achieved if adequate supplies were available on local incomes and if incomes among the poor were matched to these local market opportunities. Via Campesina's opposition to these policies emphasized that this approach to food security did not offer local farmers any voice in shaping the institutional structure of food systems. What is more, the emphasis on what Sen had called income-based entitlements paid no heed to the relationship between farming systems and cultural aspects of food that might be associated with unique varieties, seasonality, or other factors that would be associated with local production methods. Now, an exhaustive discussion of food sovereignty is well beyond the scope of my talk this morning. Some authors have emphasized resistance to global institutions such as the WTO or the power of international corporations. Excuse me. This interpretation of food sovereignty would actually return to Crocker's initial conceptualization of agency as a capability that relates to political voice and that would be ensured by strengthening the ability of poor people, in this case poor farmers, to play a meaningful role in determining the shape of the institutions and governance under which they live. It is fully compatible, I would say, with the characterization of farmer agency that I've just given. Yet in this context today, it may be especially important to emphasize the economic agency of poor farmers. By participating in the planning and decision-making of the production process, farmers and fishermen engage a form of agency that is not shared even by considerably better compensated workers in industrial settings. It is thus especially relevant to see food sovereignty as bearing an important relationship to direct production food entitlements. The importance of maintaining this capability for economic and also political agency is an important reason why this form of food entitlement, the direct production entitlement, has significance beyond ensuring a safe and adequate supply of food. Now, this is not an attempt to paint the lot of the peasant farmer as a rosy one. There are many who would gladly trade their farming for low-wage factory employment. This fact shows why the connection to food security must not be obscured in the food sovereignty discourse. The lack of a secure direct production entitlement for a farmer earning less than €1 today may make wage employment for €2 highly attractive. The attractions of wage labor may also be reinforced in cultures in which farming is viewed negatively, where farmers have little or no social prestige, and where leaving farming is viewed as a step up the social ladder. In such settings, not uncommon in some underdeveloped countries, a smallholder's trial of poverty is exacerbated by the lack of dignity. It is no wonder that small farmers eagerly accept jobs in such circumstances. My approach to the ethics of food does not hold that farmers necessarily want to remain in farming, much less that they should want to remain in farming. Nonetheless, we should acknowledge that as farmers, they possess a capability for economic agency that can be exercised as a functioning. Their capability for agency will be weakened when they exit farming and enter the wage-earning class. This may be a trade-off they're prepared to make, but nonetheless, this is part of what food sovereignty is claiming against development programs that focus too heavily on cash income and market access. At the same time, there are societies that venerate smallholding farmers. Farming are esteemed for their resourcefulness and self-reliance. They are praised for their independence and for their diligence. Such virtues are tied to farming in Eastern and Western cultures alike, and they are closely intertwined with the fact that farmers have economic agency. A society that's composed of people who make their living through farming, fishing, or other types of food production will, it is sometimes claimed, attain a form of social independence and a recognition of the burdens that must be assumed in order to assure a future social political sustainability and democratic governance. Thomas Jefferson is perhaps the most famous advocate of this. He wrote, "Corruption of morals in the mass of cultivators is a phenomenon of which no age nor nation has furnished an example. It is the mark set on those who, not looking up to heaven, to their own soil and industry, as does the husbandman for their subsistence, depend on it for the casualties and caprice of customers. Dependence begets subservience, and venality suffocates the germ of virtue and prepares fit tools for the designs of ambition," end quote. Now, we could say a lot of Jefferson had problematic views in some respects, but I'm going to skip that and wave my hands. The music swells up. Jefferson argues that farmers are especially valuable owing to their willingness to actually assume some burdens of citizenship, in short. And some arguments for food sovereignty actually reflect Jeffersonian praise of farmers. Here, the exercise of farming is said to secure not only food sovereignty and economic agency, but also a kind of dignity and self-reliance that would be valued in all citizens. So let me summarize briefly. For 2 decades after the publication of Famine, Affluence, and Morality, philosophers pursued development ethics under a rubric of world hunger. Amartya Sen's work on famine countered the Malthusian assumptions behind much of that work. A new adage held that it's not the total amount of food that's the problem, it's the distribution of income. Work in development ethics began to proceed as if a general ethic of improving the distribution of income, on the one hand, and strengthening the political agency of the poor, on the other, were the key problems, and that a specific emphasis on food production or the right to food was not really necessary. While I would not argue against the significance of improving incomes and strengthening agency, I have argued that a more nuanced understanding of the way that food entitlements contribute to the capabilities is also important. Crucially, a unilateral focus on strengthening income-based entitlements can actually have negative effects on food security, especially when that approach is implemented through policies that aim solely to lower the price of food. While it may be right to de-emphasize total global food production in development ethics, the institutional structure of direct production food entitlements is actually a key to addressing hunger and food security. Thank you. At the same time, recent calls for attention to food sovereignty have initiated a new politics of food that goes well beyond the ethics of food security. On the one hand, this is a politics in which food is a pivot point for conflict between the haves and have-nots. In this, food becomes a topic for expression of political and economic agency. Patterns of development that emphasize income growth by moving people out of agriculture may well be undercutting this element of capability in the name of developmental progress. The analysis that I've just given suggests that capabilities provide an interpretive framework in which the food security aspect of direct production entitlements actually complements a form of economic agency that's derived from food production practices. In making the political case for preserving and strengthening economic agency capabilities, food sovereignty movements become a contested form of political agency. At the same time, for food producers at least, food security and economic agency are tightly interwoven. In short, an ethic of development cannot afford to neglect the peculiar needs of farmers and other food producers. It must begin from a rich understanding of the unique role that food production plays in structuring capability for a majority of the world's poor. Thank you.
Okay, now we have 20 minutes for questions. And those, should we do the same format that we did yesterday, 3 people at a time? Is it, I don't know, or do we just one at a time? We can try one at a time, and then if you want to ask in Spanish, that's fine too, and we can translate it. Okay, so who wants, yeah, I can also translate it.
Microphones are coming.
Okay.
Thank you, Paul, for a really brilliant backward look to sources that we all grappled with many years ago, and for moving us forward in an exciting and I think really stimulating way. I think many of us here have worried about fetishizing agency, at least political agency, and wanting to distinguish different kinds of agency and how they might be related. My question concerns the work of a person that I hope will become a member of IDEA in the future, Fernando Villarán, Peruvian, who was the Minister of Labor in the Toledo administration, and now has an academic position in the Jesuit University in Lima. Fernando wants to say many of the same things about micro enterprises, small enterprises, medium enterprises, most of these being profit-making enterprises. And when he and I have talked together and have lectured together, we've often talked about the importance of what you call economic agency and how it relates to political agencies. Sometimes they go together, sometimes they're at odds with each other. I'd like you to comment on how the self-sustaining, productive farmer who is dealing with his or her own needs, how this farmer would relate to the small business person in the micro enterprise, and obviously some similarities, but also some important differences.
That's a great question, and I actually think this is one of the places I've always really, whenever I like Thomas Jefferson, but I'm very deeply aware of some of the problems with Jefferson, but Jefferson has the answer to this, right? And it's not a perfect answer, but Jefferson basically campaigned at the origins of the U.S. Republic against Alexander Hamilton for a future that would be focused on supporting agricultural producers rather than supporting small and maybe not so small entrepreneurs. Hamilton's argument was actually would have sounded very familiar to us. It was we need jobs and we need advanced technology. And that time, advanced technology were textile mills. Jefferson won the debate and chose a future, or at least an early trajectory for the United States that was focused on trying to develop the country around expanding agricultural production. And his argument for this was, and this is referred to in the little passage that I read from the notes on the state of Virginia, that there is because farmers are tied to the land, that was Jefferson's phrase, there is a sense in which their economic interest is at least tied to the future of the nation. And Jefferson had lived through a time in which many of the merchants and small producers who had been in the American colonies prior to the Revolution had basically picked up their shops and picked up their tools and their machines and left. They fled the country during the Revolution and really had no sense of loyalty or a common interest in the fate of their society. So when Jefferson praises farmers, he's praising them as citizens. He thinks that there is a way in which their economic interest is more closely tied to the country. Now, in some respects, this doesn't solve our problems, and even Jefferson recognized that the United States would eventually become a very industrialized country. But the hope, Jefferson's hope, was that what would happen as a result of having been a farming nation and a nation of smallholders. Jefferson did not, although he had a fairly large farm himself, he didn't really envision big estates being the kind of farming that would be done in the U.S. That there would be this sense of loyalty and appreciation of the way in which an economic capability needs to be tied to political capabilities and needs to be tied to a larger future for the country. Now this is, maybe this hasn't been realized in the United States, right? Maybe we can look at the history of the United States and say, it's too bad Jefferson's dream really didn't materialize, but I do think that he points to, at least on philosophical grounds, a way in which purely economic capabilities, on the one hand he's talking about how economic capabilities are important, but he's also tying them to a notion of citizenship, and this becomes really critical for making them viable. So I would qualify unbridled endorsement for small business and entrepreneurships in much the same way that Jefferson tried to qualify it, that it really, as a developmental value, it really needs to be firmly embedded in a democratic tradition and in one in which economic activity is seen as contributing to some sense of the common good.
Paul, this is really fascinating talk. A lot that I want to ponder. I don't know this literature on food sovereignty as opposed to food security, but I wonder, you've written on agrarianism and its influence in American political thinking. Do you see this It just strikes me that the agrarian movement, as we see it in the West, is so very different from what we're describing. It tends to be very conservative, socially, culturally, politically, or in some ways politically. Do you see this as a kind of parallel with industrialized world agrarian movements, or just two movements that happen to have a few points of overlap that are fundamentally different in their philosophical orientation?
I think that agrarian movements are, I think that what we really need to learn from agrarian philosophies, from agrarian thinking, is this point that of seeing economic agency as crucial and seeing it as tied to an environmental, now we would talk about an environmental stewardship sort of motivation, and as also tied, the food security link is important, right? That it is actually tied to very basic human needs and to subsistence, and it actually, I think, gives us a way of thinking about sustainability. But the gesture that I made in the paper to property rights is also a source of deep conservatism in those movements. And if that conservatism expresses itself as, you know, I mean, the kind of thing that Jefferson would have approved of would be, you know, let's not vote benefits unless we're willing to also vote for the taxes to pay for those benefits, right? That's a kind of a sentiment that it might support. You know, some sense of larger vision of the both economic and political and environmental sustainability of a society. But if it gets too closely wedded to a kind of paranoia about property rights, or in the United States, guns, then it takes a very, you know, it takes a very nasty turn.
Yeah, and I'm thinking not a Tea Party, but a Wendell Berry.
Yeah.
That kind of agreement.
Yeah, that's right.
So there's parallels.
Yes, Berry's an interesting case, and you know, in some respects, I mean, I actually mostly agree with Wendell Berry. You know, there are a few places where I would depart with his views, but you know, I think that he actually, those of you, Wendell Berry's not widely known outside the United States, but you know, has really tried to take a long tradition of agrarian thinking and really make it much more strongly committed to environmental values. Even at the point of the Jefferson, though, there were others who were political supporters of Jefferson who were tying, you know, Jefferson made a kind of agrarian argument, but you know, he had political supporters who were tying it to slavery, right? Agrarianism was why we had to have slavery in the United States. So these are not argument forms that I would license without a great deal of restraint and critical perspective.
Buenos días. Bueno, pues agradecer mucho la conferencia, muy interesante. Muy interesante, y bueno, más para mí que trabajo el tema de la intensificación de la agricultura desde la filosofía en México con el caso del maíz. Y bueno, la verdad, los escritos de usted me han servido mucho para tener unas perspectivas sobre lo que ha ocurrido en el campo. Y bueno, al inicio mencionaba acerca de una cifra de la producción, del número de productores en Estados Unidos, que es, si no me equivoco, es el 2%, en Europa el 4%, y bueno, en el resto del mundo es 50% de la población vive en la ciudad y el resto se dedica al campo. Y bueno, en México, aunque tenemos una tradición de agricultura con el maíz, digamos con la intensificación de la agricultura, este modelo se rompe, y la verdad a todos los que consumimos nos cuesta trabajo ligar de dónde provienen nuestros alimentos. Me quedé con una pregunta, ¿no? ¿Cómo resignificar el papel de los campesinos desde la filosofía?
Well, I think that, you know, one of the reasons why I continue to quote Jefferson, even though I find him to be a problematic figure in many ways, is because I do think that that he did have actually profound understanding of the way that farming and living close to the land is actually also tied to a notion of citizenship. And I think that it really is important to find, rethink the importance of farming. And most cultures, it varies from one culture to another, but most cultures have some, some literature, some wisdom literature, some poetry, or some philosophy. In Asian philosophy, you find this in Confucius, that talks about the farmer as a particularly important and venerable figure who exhibits a certain sort of wisdom and an ability to balance many perspectives. And I think that we need to find ways to draw on that to really rehabilitate the image of the farmer. I'm currently doing some work with a number of Chinese farmers, and that image of the farmer has really lost a lot of credibility in China today. Many people see the small farmer in China as a pitiable figure and someone who really is to be, deserves little respect and gets little dignity. So, on the one hand, I do think that we need to rehabilitate some of these traditions. And I think that talking about the way in which farmers unite a number of capabilities through their activity is actually, it's the way that I'm really trying to think through this myself right now. I think it remains to be seen whether this will have much traction or much ability to unify thinking around the importance of farming and agriculture. But I would agree that we should all be trying to think about how we're going to get some hold on the importance of farming, and in some respects slow down this tendency to solve our problems in agriculture or the problem of incomes in agriculture just by moving to a very, very small number of people that are producing our food. I think that really undercuts a number of other larger social sources of social solidarity and environmental insight. So that's kind of where I am right now. It's perhaps not a very adequate answer, but just to say that I agree that this is really an important thing for us to be thinking about.
Thanks, Paul. How far does the recent work of the UN Rapporteur on the right to food take in the dimensions and concerns that you were raising?
I really am extremely impressed with the work that he has done. I was fortunate to hear him speak about 2 years ago, and I thought he gave a fantastic talk, and I'm stealing some of his ideas in the talk that I just presented right here. On the other hand, when you read the reports that are on the Rapporteur's webpage, they read very much like committee documents. I think this is, I think probably just the inevitable result of being part of the UN system. So I hope that when he ends his tour as the Rapporteur, he actually starts to produce some work that really has some of the emotion and some of the power that I heard when I heard him speak.
Thanks, Paul. I really appreciate your attempt to develop the idea of economic security on capability ideas. I'm wondering, and so you talked about it in relation to smallholders, but as you know, for centuries we've had these big landlord-tenant relations, and then come the Green Revolution, the tenants got turned into landless laborers. So very briefly, what does economic security mean for farm labor, considering that farm labor is in many ways different from industrial labor?
Well, farm labor is in many respects, converting to a system of, as bad as shareholders have been, and particularly in the United States is the case that I know best. In many respects, going to a system of wage labor, it can be even more problematic. It can work if you have a number of institutional protections, unemployment insurance and, some kind of healthcare system. And if you've got all of that stuff wrapped around it, then, perhaps it can function. But what happens is you need agricultural laborers on a very, particularly in these large systems, on a very regular basis. And so they provide a very insecure source of support. Sometimes people work out systems where they go and work for a season, in the pineapple plantation, and then they go back and tend their plot. So they're kind of, they're using this wage labor as a way to supplement a kind of direct production entitlement of their own. But that creates an additional layer of problems. We've seen globally, and we're seeing this, one of the things that really worries me is that we see a number of things that are really altering the incentives of landowners, landowning elites. I mean, I don't want to sit here and defend landowning elites, but the model that James Scott presents of South Asian tenant farmers is compared to what we're seeing today, where the incentives of landowners are to kick all the tenants off and let's start a biofuel plantation. That's actually a relatively attractive picture, because there really is a certain kind of reciprocity between the landowner, who certainly derives a disproportionate benefit, but nonetheless has some interest in dealing fairly with the tenant farmer, and you can actually see some stability in those kinds of systems. So I don't have an answer to your question, but I think all of the incentives that we see today to industrialize agriculture, to create new uses for industrial crops. I mean, this is leading to land grabs. I mean, we could have our whole conference on those, some of those kinds of issues. And it's very difficult to know where one goes, and in some respects I see myself as, in trying to articulate, this agrarian vision, which is the title of my last book, it's really trying to provide at least some source of sympathy for a different way of understanding how agriculture could be, because I think many people think that this trend is either A, inevitable, or B, a good thing because it's contributing to economic growth and so on and so forth. And I don't have to speak to those arguments in this room.
Well, my question.
Go ahead, Lauren.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. I learned a lot, and it was very interesting. My question comes from years ago. I had a brief experience working in an agricultural economic part of an economic consulting firm, and I was on a project in Nicaragua for seeds, and a lot of what we were trying to do there, at least as I understood it, but a lot of what we were trying to do there was change the way farming was done, because some of the farming practices were not only inefficient, but they were bad for the environment. People would plant grain instead of plant seed. They would slash and burn and make little plots. And so a lot of those inefficiencies are being taken away. And I'm wondering, I know that's not the sort of thing you want to keep going when you're talking about keeping farmers farming because it was inefficient. But I'm wondering if you could speak more to what the movements are that are making it so few farmers, and where you think the line might be. Because on the one hand, we do want to eliminate some of these inefficiencies because they're counterproductive.
If I were going to recommend one book, and it's not a book with a lot of solutions, but a wonderful book by a couple of a French economist and actually an agricultural engineer, which is called A History of World Agriculture, really talks about a number of agricultural systems that they believed were sustainable and that worked, and a number that didn't. And their end argument is that smallholding farmers really do need a lot of help. It's not like they're all, they are not all farming sustainably. And in fact, population growth has in fact placed strain on the environment, maybe not for the kind of reasons that the Ehrlichs imagined, but because when you do have survival in rural communities, you wind up taking a farm that might have been handed down to one person and splitting it up among 2 people or 3 people or 4 people. And so a slash and burn can be a sustainable system, but as more people start trying to practice that system, you get shorter cycles and then it becomes unsustainable. And in fact, I think there really are many places in the world in which smallholder farming isn't sustainable anymore. And then when you add climate change into that, you get just another layer of problems. So there is a need for, I think, a fairly significant involvement from agricultural science and from support for farmers in terms of exploring and making changes in their production systems, getting more out of them. Actually, Luis participated in an effort that was that I led a number of years ago with FAO to start introducing an idea of sustainable intensification, right? This idea that we don't really want to necessarily just preserve the systems that are out there, but we do want to, neither do we want to move to what we've seen in industrial production systems in the United States, and actually many parts of Latin America have very industrialized production systems. And so just, it's I think, an area where there will need to be quite a bit of research and quite a bit of creative thinking, and it will probably need to be very regionally focused in order for it to have any kind of success. But it isn't really just a matter of, and if I have any pushback against some of the things that go with the food sovereignty campaigns, I do think that they sometimes tend to be less appreciative of the way in which there may need to be some changes in some of these production systems.
Just 2 more questions.
Thinking about the importance of small farms, and thinking about the importance of entitlement for direct food production, I'm thinking about poverty in the schools and the role of small farms and within the schools. And the first time I think I was acquainted with this was because there are school farms within the schools. The opportunity, when we talk about poverty, low-income schools, poverty schools, then what we do is we subsidize the lunches. So we provide money to lower the cost of the lunches. I'm thinking that a much better program would be to have farming opportunities for the students to participate in this kind of a program.
Yeah, so looking at urban areas, shifting away from the rural to the urban, there are many ways in which food systems can be, I think, more productively and justly organized. Farm-to-school programs would be one example. There you're actually really, we really need to rethink the way that urban areas are sourced and start thinking not only about the food security of urban areas, but how can we structure food systems so that we create something that at least makes people aware that the food doesn't come from a store, right? Or, I mean, those of us who teach in food have lots of these stories, but I taught a course last year in which it became clear that one of my students thought a baked potato was a manufactured item. He thought there was this kind of potato stuff, and it goes to a factory, and it either comes out as French fries or it comes out as baked potatoes, right? And we make fun of this, but there's very little culturally that we do in our education systems and in our industrial culture that would suggest anything else. So we actually need to, do something in our urban food systems that not only sources food that's more nutritional and that has creates better balanced diets, but that it also makes people feel like they're actually involved in the ecology when they're eating a meal. And I think there are starting to be a lot of exciting things happening globally. I have one of the groups that I work with at Michigan State is a consortium, has created a consortium I think about 7 global cities that are really starting to rethink how their food system is going to be structured. And so there are many small things that can be done, and I think they're all part of a development ethic in many respects.
Yes, your paper helped me clarify a number of issues in my head, but my question concerns something I'm not sure I heard very much about in your talk, which is monoculture for export. One of my African students told me about, and I wish I knew the size of the surfaces of land involved, but apparently his father was a farmer, and he resisted a movement in the area whereby all of the neighbors converted to growing pineapple for export, but he didn't. And then the pineapple market collapsed, and all the neighbors arrived at his door wanting food, because you can only eat so many pineapples in a day.
Yes, so monoculture systems are, I think the idea behind sustainable intensification is really to try to move away from monoculture production systems. Sustainable intensification, is another kind of movement within agriculture is agroecology. I think agroecology has a little bit less of a commitment to actually getting more food out of a production system than sustainable intensification does. But they certainly share the idea that you can actually, part of what makes a monoculture efficient is that you're only measuring one output, right? I mean, it's, from the standpoint of mathematics, it's much easier to understand what you're getting out of a monoculture than out of an area where you may be producing, 15 different crops and also have some livestock and some other wildlife that are all utilizing the environment together. But I think a lot of the thinking, certainly, living in the college, half of my job at Michigan State is in the College of Agriculture, and it's certainly not the case that everybody agrees over there, but having spent a career now, more than 30 years working in colleges of agriculture, there's been very much a sea change, and there's a lot more enthusiasm about looking at more complex farming systems, generally speaking, recognition that with monocultures come much more difficult pest control problems and much more difficult pollution issues, really a whole set of issues that probably it's not the best way to think about how to get food out of an environment.
Thank you very much. This concludes our plenary session this morning. We have gone over time. I'm sorry I haven't done such a good job as a chair. There were just some interesting questions and discussion. So this will shorten coffee time to 20 minutes. I'm sorry about that. Hemos concluido esta sesión desde mañana. Lo siento mucho por alargarlo un poquito más, pero vamos a cortar el tiempo de refrigerio hasta 20, vamos a tener 20 minutos no más. Gracias. Y agradecemos a Paul también.